I'm Helena Arahuete. My maiden name is Dobrovolsky. I went to school in Argentina from kindergarten through university. I attended University of Buenos Aires. As a child, I loved art and I was pretty good at drawing and painting. So my parents hired an art teacher when I was little. So I took art lessons, and then I also loved reading. I'm an only child, and when there were no other children available to play with, I would read. My parents were very, very avid readers, and I loved history of art. In fact, it started when I was little with historic type novels. And then I wanted to find out who were those people and whether they really existed. And then I advanced to reading about lives of artists. And I progressed a little bit with painting and sculpting. But then after reading about the artists, I realized that most of them died in poverty, and myself, being an only child, and I had to be self-sufficient, so I better find something that could allow me to live off my profession. And at that time, I met someone who was studying architecture and another friend who would teach history of architecture. And I loved it, but I thought, well, all this is beautiful, but it belongs to the time when it happened, where there was a correlation between art and music and literature in different times in history, but now we need, something new. And I read about Frank Lloyd Wright, and when there was a book written by Bruno Zevi toward an organic architecture, and that really inspired me. This is what I want to be. And my friends were very much architecturally and artistically inclined, so I went straight to architecture school. I had to work my way through school. Luckily, the National University understands that students have to work sometimes unless they have wealthy parents that support them. Even though the national universities are totally free, but they are considered the hardest ones to attend. And they would encourage you, or the students, to work as long as it's in a related field. So at that time, when I started architecture, my parents had decided to move to the United States. But I did not want to move because I wanted to study. And of course, studies in the States are incredibly expensive, and I did not have the means. And I met my husband, so we got married, and we were both studying. He was studying business administration, and I was going to night classes. And I was lucky enough that I found work in different construction companies and architectural offices, and I tried to change jobs about every year, so I would learn different things. So by the time I graduated, I had 5 years plus of working experience in construction sites, And I loved construction as well. I would build little things, when I was little, like a shelter or a house for the cat or the dog. But I loved construction and working with my hands, as well as all the creative aspects of architecture. We have 3 years of history of art and architecture at the university, and in the last year had a whole chapter called Frank Lloyd Wright. And his apprentices were mentioned there, like Richard Neutra and John Lautner. And when I arrived in the States with my husband, that was in 1971, end of 1971. And I started looking for work. It just happened that my father, who was a mechanical engineer, was doing some consulting work with another engineer who owned one of Lautner houses. So my father mentioned, oh, my daughter is coming and she's an architect. Oh, well, when she arrives, I have her call me and I'll give a phone number of this excellent architect I know. And so I called him. I spoke good enough English because my parents had made me take English lessons when I was quite young. And when I heard John Lautner's name, I said, oh, wow, this is probably the same architect I had to study about back in Argentina. So I gave him a call, and he had a very open policy with his office. And he said, yes, of course, come on over. So I went to his office, and that was just maybe 3 weeks after I arrived. And he started showing me sketches of a house in Acapulco. And he told me that he actually needed a designer or an architect who would be experienced in architectural concrete, exposed concrete, the metric system, and the Spanish language, because all the drawings had to be both in English and Spanish, because the structure engineers and, of course, the builders were in Mexico. So I qualified, on 3 accounts, and he hired me, right away. So the first month, because I was used to working month by month, I told him I will work for whatever, you don't know what kind of work I do, so I'm ready to work for whatever you want to pay me, but if you're happy, at the end of 1 month, I will be happy to stay. The following year, because I was used to changing jobs, I started looking around to see what other architects were doing, and there happened to be an exhibit, and I saw other architects' work, and I said, I'm in the very best place. This is the most creative architect I ever met. I stayed for 23 years. He also practiced the learning by doing, which he experienced while being an apprentice of Frank Lloyd Wright. So he would just throw the problem to you and have you solve it. And of course, I would check back with him and ask him, well, do you like, oh, yes, go ahead. I loved the challenge and the creativity. And I realized that I had so much autonomy, in the design. I had more knowledge, really, generally, about architecture and construction than other people there. So I think Lautner recognized that, and eventually, you know, I was used to having a lot of solidarity with my co-workers, because that's the way school and work functioned back in Argentina. While here I found that people were very, very protective with information. But whenever somebody had a question, I would solve it, or if I couldn't solve it, tell him who to ask to have it solved. So naturally, I started supervising, you know, others in the office. And I had a very professional relationship with John Lautner, who showed me, you know, a lot of respect. And I knew all the clients, because whenever someone new showed up as a potential client, he was extensively interviewed in terms of his preferences, his lifestyle, and his needs. Sometimes he would draw himself or take a few things and make a very, very rough model. But on other occasions, because I would go with him to the site, he would say, oh, yeah, here we can, the ocean and the Santa Monica Mountains. Let's do something like this, so we can see the ocean and the mountains. I was working for him, but he gave me so much freedom, and he mostly agreed with what I was doing, but you know, he always expected you to do your best. Lautner had a great admiration for Frank Lloyd Wright. To him, Frank Lloyd Wright was a genius. But Lautner was wise enough to understand that the genius was in the principles, not in the forms. So he followed the philosophy of Frank Lloyd Wright, but he never copied him. You could see the influence of some of the prairie houses in the very, very first work that Lautner did, because he was gradually departing from that. On the other hand, he resented, obviously, being always recognized as John Lautner, architect, an apprentice of Frank Lloyd Wright, because he was a great architect in his own standing. And what I tried to do was in a way the same. I shared the philosophy and the principles, but I always tried to do my own thing. Because especially people here think that everybody has to be a specialist. So if you do houses, you can only do houses, which is wrong, because we are trained to do any type of building, of course following the program of requirements, if it's a school or a hospital. While working for John Lautner, I did a rehabilitation center for handicapped children. So it's not that he only did houses or only did houses for rich people. It just happened that magazines are always interested in the most spectacular to publish. They don't pay so much attention to little remodels, even though they may require more ingenuity and problem solving than a building that you design from scratch. Sometimes we were only females, and it was interesting. I mean, he had an office of maybe 3 people on average, sometimes 4, sometimes 2. And on one period of time, we were just women. And it was interesting to see that somebody came to the door looking for the architectural office, and he would, is this the architecture? Oh yes, come in. And I would like to mention that there are very many women architects in Argentina. Even my professors at the university on technical subjects. So I took for granted that being a woman in architecture is the normal thing, while after moving to the United States at the age of 27, I was surprised that I was constantly asked whether I had any problems for being a woman in architecture. And my answer was I did not expect to have problems, so I never did, But still nowadays, whenever I give a lecture, I would get the same question. How could I, function as a woman? And then women get happy because, they say, well, I inspire them, I said, definitely, you have to go ahead. When I just started working for John Lautner, someone else was working on the Hope House. And construction started. The house, by the way, originally was conceived as a concrete structure, but on account of the cost, and the Hopes wanted to save money, even though they wanted a very, very large house. So it had to be changed to steel and wood. And again, it was conceived as a gigantic tent by Mr. Lautner that had to have the shape of a volcano to blend with the surrounding mountains. And the idea was to finish the roof with the same type of gravel, so it would be basically camouflaged and not so visible. It would look like another mountain, but because we needed natural light, he opened the center, as a crater. So for him, that was the crater of the volcano. Of course, the roof was so large because there was Bob Hope Golf tournament, and after the tournament, the Hopes would invite the participant, and they wanted that large open but covered terrace to sit 250 to 300 people for dinner. In any case, that was built first, and then the interior, the partitions, the rooms, walls, and so on, were to be done after, under the protective shelter of the roof. While the roof was under construction and all the plywood was on, a welder was welding steel structure at one of the ends. The welder was working for a company called Peter Kiewit, a very large construction company. And Peter Kiewit was a personal friend, apparently, of Mrs. Hope. So she let go of the builder that only started it, because he was a small builder, even though he had built for Frank Lloyd Wright, and that was John Lautner's choice. So she hired this big company whose subcontractor, the welder, did not protect a large enough area. It was Palm Springs, the middle of the summer, I happened to be in the office when I received the call that the house is on fire. So it was gone. All the wood in 15 minutes. And that night I saw Bob Hope on TV joking that the house burned down because the guards at the gate on Southridge Drive would not let the fire department through. Since the original fire happened so quickly, the existing steel structure, trusses mostly, were not damaged because the fire went so fast. So otherwise, the steel gets damaged as well. But it was all reused, and the materials that were used were all metal, corrugated metal for the roof, and metal studs, metal structure, everything. A lawsuit started against the construction company and of course, the subcontractor. And also the Hopes were suing their own lawyer because he had to take fire insurance during construction, and he didn't. He just procrastinated, and so there was no insurance. So this lawsuit lasted about 5 years. The man who was working on the original version of the house was gone by then. And after the Hopes won the lawsuit, Mrs. Hope, who was really the person in charge there of the house, wanted to build it like right away. So design and build, which was very stressful. And at that point, I had finished another job that for Lautner, and he assigned me to be the project architect of the Hope House. So I worked for 2 years on the house, but the original interior designer was Arthur Elrod, who was also a friend of Mrs. Hope, and she liked his house so much that she told him that she wanted to hire the same architect. That's how John Lautner got the job. But tragically, Arthur Elrod died in a car accident before, the construction continued. And Mrs. Hope hired an interior designer friend who had done work for the sister of the then Shah of Iran. And her vision was all, golden mirrors, golden swans for the faucets, and paper, wallpaper, and she did not understand, the continuity that from inside to outside, so she wanted to change materials, and Mrs. Hope wanted a pink roof. She did not want the gravel on top. So the original roof was pink and terracotta. We called it terracotta. And a lot of the interiors, the living room in the second floor, what was very, very high, was to look like her living room in another house she had in Los Angeles. But the interiors were all finished by Laura Mako, the interior designer friend, which I could never understand. How could Mrs. Hope like the Elrod house, which was radically different from what the interior decorator did. Lautner got very frustrated with all those changes that were imposed, And I had to go there almost every week, every 2 weeks. Sometimes I would drive Mr. Lautner, with me. And it was stressful. We had like 14-hour-long meetings at the job site. Then she would invite him or me for lunch at her other house in Palm Springs and be the nicest person. And then we'd go back to the site and she would go like this to everybody. So people would hide and get scared of her. That was interesting. So time went by, and at one point they decided to change the roof. Something probably failed in the roof. So it was finished with a copper coating, metal with copper coating. And initially it would shine, like the sun sitting on the mountain there. But luckily, eventually, the copper turned into brown, greenish, then brown. Both Bob Hope and Dolores Hope passed away, and the daughter decided to sell the house. So she called me and asked me to give a little talk to other real estate people at the house. It wasn't selling. Of course, they were asking $50 million. Then I learned that Ron Burkle was considering buying the house. And Burkle said that he really liked the Lautner architecture, but he would buy the house only if it could be done the way it was supposed to be done originally. I went to the site with Mr. Burkle, and I looked around, and he said he really wanted, not just the wallpaper removed, but to have it right. And I said, no problem. But there will be a lot of demolition, because in the meantime, there were other structures that were added, that were changed completely. And he said, fine. And he decided to buy the house then. I showed him drawings of what I would do, what I would recommend, to be demolished and what had to be redone. I explained everything to him, and he liked the ideas. So he bought the house for a much cheaper price. I didn't ask him how much, because it was not I don't ask if I don't have to. And so I got going. They found a very good general contractor for the house and good superintendent. At the same time, they found very good craftsmen, tradesmen to do the stonework and the wood finishes. So it was a pleasure working with them. And I went into, all the details, because since, I know construction and I know what I want it to look. So I would go there quite often. By that time, I was quite well aware of what John Lautner would have done, plus the requirements of the new owner. And I should add to that the fact that I had witnessed during the many years of work with John Lautner how he restored and remodeled his own previous work. And contrary to trying to find exactly the hardware and all the details that belong to the time of the original design, he would try to make it better and use the latest technology, but of course still keep the same grammar of the house, the same kind of when I talk about it, good architecture, the space is like it has a soul, and you have to keep that. But otherwise, you are free to change things around. So I felt totally free in changing whatever I thought had to be changed at the Hope House, because I saw him do that to his own projects.